In this video, we are going to focus on phylum Mollusca, or the mollusks. And remember that we are still talking about a phylum in the superphylum Lophotrochophores. And these are animals that are protostomes. They have bilateral symmetry. They have specialized tissues. And of course, they are animals. Mollusks are eucoelomates, otherwise known as coelomates, and that just means that they have a coelom or an internal body cavity. In mollusks, it primarily only surrounds the heart. A few characteristics of the mollusks includes that they have a muscular foot, which you can see here. And that foot helps them to move around in their environment. It also helps to anchor them in place. They have a mantle, which is a tissue that secretes the material to make up the shell. So mollusks are typically these animals that have a shell. So things like a snail, that is an example of a mollusk. And so the mantle, as you can see, is this tissue here that is just deep to the shell. And then the shell itself, that material, that calcium and other molecules is secreted by the mantle to make the shell. They also have this area known as the visceral mass, and that is where the internal organs are located. So you can see that they have a stomach and a heart, gonads, etc., etc. As I mentioned, the visceral mass contains the internal organs. Mollusks do have a complete digestive system. That essentially means that food goes in one end and comes out the other. And you'll notice that it's kind of interesting that the anus is right above the mouth, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on another slide. But you can see that the digestive organs include things like a stomach, an intestine, and then the anus. They also have a nervous system. They have nerve cords here. They have excretory structures, which are not shown on this picture here, but this would be kind of equivalent to the urinary system. They have reproductive structures. You can see the gonad here. And for respiration, so gas exchange, for the aquatic species, they have gills. And then terrestrial species have a sort of lung-like organ. So now we're going to take a look at some of the different varieties of organisms found in this phylum. So first of all, we're going to talk about the class known as Polyplacophores. And the name, poly means many, and placophore must mean plate because the name translates to many plates. And as you can see on the picture, this animal is made up of multiple plates. So each one of these kind of segments is a plate or a segment of the shell. And these are animals known as chitons. And you can see it in the picture here. It's kind of all camouflaged, but it's this thing here. One kind of distinguishing feature is that they have a radula. And a radula is this kind of rough textured tongue-like structure that helps them to scrape algae off of rocks, and that's what they eat. Class Bivalvia is another kind of subset or subgroup of this phylum Mollusca. And bivalves are bivalves, so bi means two. And so bivalves have two valves, or really you would probably more commonly refer to it as two shells. So you can see here, these are mussels. And this is a clam down here. And you can see that they have two shells. The clam is a little bit easier to see. This mussel picture is a little bit small, but if you've ever eaten a mussel, you know that it's got these two shells that kind of clamp together. They are attached by ligaments on one side that makes it like a hinge, so it kind of opens like a book or a door. The ventral side has shell teeth, and then there are muscles that open and close the shell. So some examples, like we said, we've got our clams and our mussels, also things like oysters and scallops. They are found in both marine and freshwater habitats. Marine just means saltwater. And they can range in size from very, very small to very, very large. So for example, a giant clam can be bigger than a human, but the mussels that you eat when you go to a seafood restaurant are much smaller. The bivalves do not show cephalization. Bivalves are filter feeders, so they are able to take in water and kind of circulate it around themselves and within themselves. And then they have gills that trap food particles. They also have these organs known as nephridia, and these are kind of like a rudimentary kidney. So it's not like a real kidney, but it kind of acts like a kidney. And it helps with excretion, so getting rid of metabolic waste products. And osmoregulation. And osmoregulation refers to maintaining the kind of the concentration of solutes in the body fluids. If you remember from a previous biology class, if you remember the concept of osmosis and tonicity, this organ helps to maintain an isotonic internal environment. So isotonic body fluids, meaning that the concentration of the body fluids is equal to the concentration of the fluids inside the cells. The bivalves do have eye spots and some other sensory structures. You can see on this clam here, they have pretty noticeable eye spots. They're these little shiny things here. So they've got a whole bunch of eyes. And they do have some nervous tissue. So they've got some ganglia. And remember, ganglia is just where the nervous system communicates with itself. So it's where one neuron connects to another neuron. And this helps to regulate activity. For example, opening and closing the muscles that help them to basically open up when they are filter feeding and then shut tight in order to prevent predation. Another class of mollusks that you are probably familiar with are the gastropods or class Gastropoda. And gastro means stomach, and poda or pod means foot. And we'll talk about why they are called the stomach foot on a future slide when we talk about something called torsion. Some examples of organisms in class Gastropoda include snails and slugs, which do not have a shell. Also things like conchs and whelks, which if you ever walk on the beach, you've probably found the shell or the remaining portion of the animal after it has died. They do have asymmetrical bodies. You can see that the shell typically takes this kind of coiled shape to it. They also do have a well-defined head, so that cephalization is present. So you can see they have this head and they have these tentacles, and then there's an eye at the end of each tentacle. You can see that here too. They've got the tentacles here, and then there's an eye at the end of each tentacle. They also have that radula. Remember that radula is that kind of rough, textured tongue that helps it to basically scrape food off of the substrate. So scraping things like algae, for example. So the gastropods get their name. Remember, gastro means stomach, and poda means foot. And they get their name because of something that happens during embryonic development known as torsion. And what happens is that essentially the back half of the animal gets twisted 180. And so instead of the digestive system essentially going in the front and out the back, instead the digestive system actually kind of twists around. And so this region of the snail is known as the foot. And so the stomach is over the foot, and that's how it gets the name of gastropod. Now, there are some benefits to this torsion. One is that they can pull their head completely back in their shell for protection. The foot can then be pulled in to essentially cover this opening to completely encase the snail. So when the snail pulls its head in, and then the foot can basically form like a little door. And sometimes the foot has something called an operculum. And an operculum is kind of like a little piece of hard shell-like material. Which gives it even more protection because now it's not just a muscular foot that's closing the door, but then there's this hard shell that's also kind of closing the door. The drawbacks to this torsion, though, is that the anus opens over the head. Remember that the anus is where the waste products come out. And so what can happen is sometimes the waste comes out over the head and it goes into the visceral mass where the waste products can actually get into the gills. And the gills are needed for gas exchange. So that would obviously be a problem. And this is a process known as fouling. Another class in the phylum Mollusca is the class Cephalopoda. And cephala means head, and poda means foot. And they get their name because they essentially are made up of a head with a modified foot, and the foot makes the tentacles. So you can see in this picture of a squid here, you've got the head region, and then the muscular foot region, which has been modified to form these tentacles. And some examples of cephalopods are going to be the octopus, which you can see here, squid, cuttlefish, and nautiluses. Now, some of these organisms have shells. So the nautilus, for example, has a true shell to it. But the others, so the cuttlefish, octopus, and squid, they don't have a traditional shell like the other mollusks. They do have a remnant of a shell internally, which we'll talk about on the next couple slides. So first, let's take a closer look at the nautilus. And this is actually a nautilus shell that has been cut open. And you can see that it has these chambers inside of it. And so a nautilus is able to basically fill these chambers with water or air in order to adjust its buoyancy. And then the animal would live inside the shell and the tentacles would be coming out the kind of the opening here. Squids and cuttlefish also have, as I mentioned, they have a kind of a shell, but it's modified from the shell that you typically think of when you think of mollusks. So the shell is internal. In squids, they have something called a squid pin. And if you've ever dissected a squid, you've probably pulled the squid pin out. It almost looks like a piece of cartilage, and it actually has a little bit of flexibility to it. Cuttlefish have what they call a cuttlefish bone. And if you go to a pet store, you maybe have seen these because these are actually sold for animals like birds in order to get calcium. So this is a way that a bird can kind of have something to munch on that actually gives it some calcium. One kind of interesting characteristic of animals in class Cephalopoda is that they have color changing skin. And this is mostly observed in squids and octopus, but nautilus and cuttlefish can also do this. The function of this color changing skin, they can use it for camouflage, they can use it to attract mates, or they can use it to communicate. So they can maybe try to scare off a predator by changing its colors. And they do this because they have these specialized cells in their skin called chromatophores. And these chromatophores can expand and contract to produce different colors and patterns. But the only colors that they can really form are yellow, red, brown, and black. But you've maybe seen an octopus that had some other coloration in it. And that's because they have additional cells that are kind of specialized to reflect light. And so the blue, green, and white colors that you see overall come from iridophores and leucophores. And if you've never seen this, I definitely recommend that you go to YouTube or Google and search for color changing cephalopods because it's really dramatic how quickly they can change their color, how much they can change it. They can even make like moving patterns, and their ability to camouflage is astonishing. Cephalopods are carnivorous predators, and so they can actually they pursue prey. They can eat things like fish and other small organisms, or I guess large organisms too. There are giant squid out there. Inside their mouth, they do have these beak-like jaws. So this is kind of the structure here in the picture is something that was taken out of a dead squid. And you can see this kind of dark portion here. This is the beak. And once again, if you've ever dissected a squid or an octopus, you've probably pulled that beak out. And it's very, very hard, and it looks like a parrot's beak. They also have that radula, which remember that is that kind of rough tongue-like structure. And it's also really interesting that these organisms have been determined to be very intelligent. They have a well-developed nervous system and eyes that can actually see and a brain that can essentially form images. And they've tested, especially octopus, in different situations, and they're able to do problem solving. I've heard of experiences in like aquariums where octopus have been able to break out of their enclosures. Um, I used to work at an aquarium where they would take a jar with a lid and they would put food inside the jar, and the octopus would be able to figure out how to open the jar to get to the food inside. And so they're just really, really neat organisms. Cephalopods have a closed circulatory system, and that's similar to what we have as humans. So we have blood that's contained within blood vessels. Those vessels run close to the gills to allow for gas exchange. And they have multiple hearts or pumps that help to move that blood around in the vessels in a particular direction. You're probably also familiar with the tentacles of cephalopods. So they have these specialized lobed feet that form arms and tentacles, and they have these suckers on them. And these suckers have chitinized rings. And if you remember, chitin is a tough polysaccharide. Which is a type of carb, a complex carb. This is the same material that's in the cell walls of fungi. It's also in the shells of arthropods, which we'll talk about in a different video. And so this chitin helps to give those suckers a little bit of kind of structure and toughness to them. It's really interesting too because they can actually taste through their suckers. And so they have the ability to chemosense, or they have chemoreceptors. And so they can essentially taste or smell with their suckers. For locomotion, they have siphons, which you can see on this picture here. And the siphon can essentially shoot out water in order to move the organism in the opposite direction. They also have ink, which is known as sepia, and whenever they are, typically when they're threatened, they can actually shoot out this kind of cloud of ink that helps to escape from predation. So it's almost like a smoke screen where they disappear and then they can get away from the predator. It also confuses the predator. Cephalopods do reproduce sexually, so sexual reproduction. They are dioecious, which means that there are separate male and female organisms. The females lay eggs, and some female cephalopods will actually protect their eggs for extended periods of time. And if they do so, they might actually die due to starvation. So there are times when, for example, an octopus might lay eggs, and that's actually going to be the end of her life. So she will protect those eggs as long as she can, but eventually will die because she's not able to feed while she's protecting them. They do not have a larval stage, meaning that when the eggs hatch, the juveniles look like adults. And so basically the babies look like little baby octopi or squid. They don't have that kind of intermediate body form that you see in things like insects.